Barbara Bel Geddes was thrilled that evening. She had invited Louis Armstrong, the man whose music she adored, to her dressing room for tea after the show. As one of Broadway's most respected actresses, meeting the jazz legend was a dream come true. But when she heard shouting in the corridor, her heart stopped. She rushed out and froze at the sight before her. Big Tony, her bodyguard, the man who protected her like a father protects his daughter, had Louis Armstrong pinned against the wall. Barbara screamed for Tony to stop, but it was too late, or so she thought. Louis Armstrong had spent 55 years walking through backstage corridors just like this one. 55 years of being turned away, humiliated, forced through service entrances. Hundreds of times people had disrespected him, and every single time he had responded with a smile, with music, with grace. That night in 1956 would be no different. Louis had options. He could have shouted, fought back, demanded justice, but Louis Armstrong did none of those things. Instead, he did something that lasted exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Big Tony's fist dropped, tears began streaming down the massive man's face, and everyone in that corridor witnessed something they would never forget for the rest of their lives. If you believe that kindness is stronger than force and that grace can transform any moment, make sure to subscribe to this channel. This is a story that will stay with you forever. But to understand why those 3 seconds were so powerful and why Louis Armstrong responded the way he did, we need to go back and understand the man who had learned to meet hostility with humanity throughout his entire remarkable life. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. Louis Armstrong was 55 years old in 1956, and he had been famous for more than 3 decades. His trumpet had revolutionized jazz music. His voice was recognized on every continent. Yet despite all his success, Louis lived in a world that often refused to treat him as an equal. He could sell out the finest concert halls in America, but frequently could not eat in restaurants near those same venues. Throughout his career, Louis had faced countless moments of disrespect. Security guards had blocked his path. Hotel managers had refused him rooms. And through all of it, Louis had never once responded with anger. He had learned early that meeting hostility with hostility only created more pain. This philosophy had been forged in New Orleans, in a childhood marked by poverty. Louis had grown up in a neighborhood so poor that people called it Backo Town. He had learned to survive by finding joy wherever he could, by making music out of nothing. That ability to transform darkness into light had become the defining characteristic of his life. Have you ever faced a moment when someone treated you unfairly? Share your experience in the comments. Tony Marconi was not a man who frightened easily. Standing well over 6 feet tall and weighing nearly 400 pounds of solid muscle, he had earned the nickname Big Tony through sheer physical presence. He had served in the Second World War, fighting in brutal battles across Europe. He had seen things that would haunt most men forever. When he came home, he found work as a bodyguard. Big Tony had been working for Barbara Bel Geddes for 2 years. She was unlike any client he had ever had. While others treated their security staff like servants, Barbara treated Tony like family. In return, Tony had developed a fierce protectiveness toward her that went beyond professional obligation. He thought of her as a younger sister. Tony's approach to his job was simple. Anyone who might pose a threat to Barbara did not get close. He acted first and sorted out explanations later. This approach had prevented several dangerous situations, but it also meant Tony sometimes made mistakes. If you are enjoying this story, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to you. Barbara Bel Geddes was 34 years old in 1956 and at the height of her Broadway career. She had earned critical acclaim for her performances in plays that tackled serious themes with emotional depth and intelligence. Critics praised her naturalistic acting style, her ability to make audiences forget they were watching a performance and believe they were witnessing real life unfolding before them. In just 2 years, she would star in Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo alongside James Stewart, cementing her place in Hollywood history. But what made Barbara truly special was not her talent alone. It was her character, her genuine warmth toward everyone she encountered regardless of their status or background. In an industry known for egos and pretension, Barbara remained remarkably grounded. She knew the names of every stagehand, every dresser, every member of the cleaning crew. She treated everyone with the same respect she expected for herself. Barbara's love of jazz music was well known among her friends and colleagues. She had grown up listening to Louis Armstrong's recordings, had worn out multiple copies of his albums, playing them over and over again. When she learned that Louis would be performing in New York the same week as her own show, she had mustered all her courage to send him an invitation. Would the great Louis Armstrong consider visiting her dressing room after his performance for tea and conversation? To her amazement and delight, Louis had accepted. The evening of the incident began like any other performance night. Barbara completed her show to enthusiastic applause, took her curtain calls, and retreated to her dressing room to prepare for her special guest. She changed into a more casual dress, arranged the tea service she had specially ordered, and tried to calm the nervous excitement fluttering in her stomach. In just a short while, she would be meeting one of her musical heroes. Louis Armstrong arrived at the theater through the main entrance, something that was not always possible for him in 1956 America. The theater manager, a fan of Louis's music, had made special arrangements to ensure the jazz legend would be welcomed properly. Louis was escorted toward the backstage area, his famous trumpet case in one hand, wearing one of his characteristic bright suits that seemed to carry sunshine wherever he went. The corridor, leading to the dressings rooms, was long and narrow, lined with doors on both sides. Various performers and crew members moved through the space, preparing for the next show or packing up from the current one. Louis walked with the easy confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating backstage environments. He hummed quietly to himself, already looking forward to meeting the young actress who had so graciously invited him. What Louis did not know was that Big Tony was waiting around the corner, and Big Tony had not been informed that Barbara was expecting any visitors that evening. Tony saw the man approaching before the man saw him, a black man in a flashy suit carrying some kind of case, walking confidently toward the dressing room doors as if he belonged there. In Tony's experience, people who walked with that kind of confidence in places they did not belong were usually up to no good. He did not recognize the face, did not know who Louis Armstrong was, did not care about jazz or music or any of that cultural stuff. All Tony saw was a potential threat to Barbara. Tony stepped into the corridor, blocking the path forward. He was an intimidating sight, filling the narrow space with his massive frame. His arms crossed over his barrel chest. He told the man to stop right there, his voice low and threatening. Louis paused, his smile faltering slightly as he took in the enormous man blocking his way. Louis explained that he was here to see Miss Bel Geddes, that she had invited him. Tony did not believe him. In his experience, people made up stories all the time to get close to celebrities. What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds. Tony moved forward aggressively, grabbed Louis by the lapels of his jacket, and shoved him against the wall. The impact knocked the breath from Louis's lungs. Tony's massive hand pressed against Louis's chest, pinning him in place. Tony's other hand formed a fist, pulled back, ready to strike if this intruder made any sudden moves. The corridor fell silent. Several people had witnessed what happened and stood frozen, unsure what to do. Someone ran to get Barbara. Someone else considered calling for theater security. But in that frozen moment, all eyes were on the two men at the center of the confrontation, the massive bodyguard and the pinned jazz legend. Have you ever witnessed a moment of conflict that transformed into something unexpected? We would love to hear your story in the comments. Barbara heard the commotion from her dressing room and rushed into the corridor. What she saw made her blood run cold. Tony, her protector, her friend, had Louis Armstrong pinned against the wall like a common criminal. The man whose voice had brought her comfort through difficult times, whose music had been the soundtrack to some of her happiest memories, was being treated like a threat. Barbara screamed Tony's name, ordering him to stop, to let go immediately. She ran toward them, her voice high with panic and disbelief. Tony heard her, but did not immediately release his grip. His protective instincts were too deeply ingrained, his suspicion of strangers too thoroughly trained. He needed a moment to process what was happening, to shift from threat response to normal awareness. In that moment, with Tony's fist still raised and Barbara still running toward them, Louis Armstrong did something extraordinary, something that lasted exactly 3 seconds, something that changed everything. Louis looked directly into Big Tony's eyes, not with fear, not with anger, not with the righteous indignation that anyone in his position would have been entitled to feel. Louis looked at Tony with something else entirely. Understanding, compassion, recognition of a fellow human being who was simply trying to protect someone he loved. And then Louis smiled, not a nervous smile, not a forced smile, but that genuine, warm, radiant smile that had charmed audiences around the world for decades. The smile that seemed to say everything was going to be all right, that there was no need for conflict, that this moment could be transformed into something better. Then Louis spoke, his voice calm and gentle despite the hands still pressed against his chest. He told Tony that he could see Tony cared about Miss Bel Geddes very much. He said that a man who protects the people he loves is a good man. He said there was no need to worry, that he was just a musician who had been invited for tea and that he appreciated Tony's dedication to keeping Barbara safe. 3 seconds. A look, a smile, a few soft words spoken without a trace of resentment or accusation. And in those 3 seconds, something remarkable happened. Big Tony felt the words hit him like nothing had ever hit him before. Not bullets, not bombs, not any of the physical violence he had survived during the war. This was different. This was a man he had just assaulted responding with kindness, with understanding, with grace. Tony had expected resistance, expected anger, expected a reaction that would justify his own aggression. Instead, he received forgiveness before he even asked for it. Tony's fist dropped to his side. His hand released Louis's jacket. He stepped back, his massive frame suddenly seeming smaller, his tough exterior crumbling. And then something happened that had never happened before in Tony Marconi's adult life. Tears began streaming down his face. This man who had not cried during the war, who had not cried when friends died beside him, who had prided himself on emotional strength that bordered on numbness, was weeping openly in a Broadway corridor. Barbara reached them just as Tony began to cry. She stood there, her hand over her mouth, witnessing something she could barely comprehend. The man who protected her, the toughest person she had ever known, was sobbing like a child. And Louis Armstrong, the man who had every right to be furious, was gently patting Tony's shoulder, telling him it was all right, telling him he understood. What happened in that corridor spread quickly through the theater community. The story was told and retold, each telling emphasizing the extraordinary grace Louis Armstrong had shown in a moment when most people would have reacted very differently. Some who heard the story found it hard to believe. How could anyone respond to physical aggression with such immediate forgiveness? But those who knew Louis were not surprised. This was simply who he was. Barbara invited both Louis and Tony into her dressing room where they shared the tea she had prepared. Tony could barely speak at first, overwhelmed with shame at what he had done and amazement at how Louis had responded. Louis put him at ease, telling stories about other misunderstandings he had experienced over the years, making light of the situation, helping Tony understand that no permanent harm had been done. By the end of that evening, something unexpected had happened. Big Tony, who had never cared about music, who had dismissed jazz as noise he did not understand, had become a devoted Louis Armstrong fan. He asked Louis about his life, his music, his philosophy. He listened with genuine interest as Louis talked about growing up in New Orleans, about learning to play trumpet in reform school, about the mentors who had shaped him. Tony had never met anyone quite like Louis Armstrong. Tony Marconi attended every Louis Armstrong concert he could get to for the rest of Louis's performing career. He would stand in the back of the venue, this enormous man with tears in his eyes, listening to the music of the person who had shown him a different way to be in the world. He told everyone he met about that night in the corridor, about the 3 seconds that had changed his understanding of what strength really meant. Barbara Bel Geddes and Louis Armstrong remained friends for years after that initial meeting. They exchanged letters, attended each other's performances when possible, and shared a mutual admiration that transcended their different worlds. Barbara often said that watching Louis respond to Tony's aggression with such grace had taught her more about acting than any class or director ever had. Real emotional truth, she realized, came from the soul, not from technique. Louis continued his career with the same philosophy that had guided him through the incident with Tony. He faced other moments of prejudice and hostility, other situations where his dignity was challenged, and he continued to respond with music, with smiles, with the unshakable belief that kindness was stronger than cruelty, that understanding could disarm any aggression, that the human heart was capable of transformation when given the chance. The story of Louis Armstrong and Big Tony became one of many such stories from Louis's remarkable life. He seemed to attract these moments, these opportunities to demonstrate that there was another way to navigate a world that often seemed determined to push people toward conflict and division. Each story reinforced the same lesson, that the choice of how we respond to others is always ours, that we can meet hostility with hostility, or we can meet it with something better. Tony Marconi lived until 1982. In his later years, he would gather his grandchildren around and tell them about the night he met Louis Armstrong backstage at a Broadway theater. He would describe how he had made a terrible mistake, how he had judged a man based on nothing but appearance and assumption. And then he would describe those 3 seconds, the look, the smile, the gentle words that had melted something frozen inside him. Tony always ended the story the same way. He would tell his grandchildren that Louis Armstrong taught him the most important lesson of his life that night. He taught him that real strength is not about how hard you can hit. Real strength is about how much love you can give when someone else is trying to hurt you. That lesson, Tony said, was worth more than anything else he had ever learned. Some people move through life creating conflict wherever they go. Others move through life creating peace. Louis Armstrong was one of those rare souls who seemed incapable of adding to the world's pain, who responded to every challenge with an instinct toward healing rather than hurting. This was not weakness. This was the deepest kind of strength, the kind that transforms not just moments but entire lives. In that Broadway corridor in 1956, 3 seconds changed everything. A massive bodyguard learned that his ideas about strength had been completely wrong. A young actress witnessed real grace under pressure and carried that lesson into her art. And Louis Armstrong simply continued being who he had always been, a man who believed that the world was wonderful and who made it more wonderful through every interaction, every smile, every note of music that flowed from his trumpet and his heart. That is the legacy of Louis Armstrong, not just the music, though the music was extraordinary, but the way he lived, the choices he made in countless small moments that added up to a life of remarkable beauty. The next time someone treats you unfairly, remember Louis Armstrong pinned against that wall. Remember the 3 seconds that changed everything. And remember that you always have a choice about how to respond. Thank you for watching this incredible story. If it moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness is the greatest strength of all.